Good morning everyone. This is Kamikawa Kailin. This time, we will answer the request of Curry 3 Momo. Koreans lie. Chinese people were still better. Is the word of an old lady who lived on the pre-war peninsula. Even now, 55 years after the conclusion of the Japan-Korea Treaty, South Korea has created a convenient history and continues to insult Japan. Yes, they haven't changed anything. Every time Korea is annexed, forcibly mobilize Koreans to exploit the labor force. He violated human rights, slaughtered Koreans, and made comfort women sex slaves. The so-called victim business, which claims to apologize and seek compensation. Ignoring international treaties, it continues to develop even 75 years after the war. Was it really such a terrible time during the integration? Before the merger, Mr. Lee was a very pre-modern slave society during the Joseon era. Compared to the post-war Korean War and the modern presidential era, was the Japan-Korea merger era really a terrible era? I think it is necessary to verify it again and again. Min Hishiku, a former university professor in South Korea. In the Japan-Korea integrated era, there was no anti-Japan, no discrimination, no trouble in life. Japan liberated the colony in Asia, while post-war South Korea's anti-Japanese education was terrible. Post-war South Korea was disturbed, and young people today do nothing. It states, if Japan's annexation of Korea continued until the present day, which is connected to the present world, was there a terrible massacre in the Korean War that killed as many as 5 million people among their relatives? Wasn't South Korea's corrupt politics after the war becoming a more decent country? October 30, 2020, Seoul Yonhap News Agency. Former South Korean President Lee Myung-bak. It is clear that a 17-year prison sentence has been finalized for crimes such as embezzlement and embezzlement. The Supreme Court of Korea announced on the 29th for bribery charges received from Samsung Electronics etc. In the appeal decision of Mr. Lee, who was charged with embezzlement of the funds of the company that he actually owns, dismiss both the defendant and the prosecution's appeal. 17 years in prison issued in the second trial, fine 13 billion won, about 1.2 billion yen. A prison sentence of about 5.78 billion won has been finalized. The arrest of the former president was in 1995 by Zen Token and No Tae-woo. And this is the fourth person following last year's Park Kyun. The history of successive presidents being judged is repeated without interruption. This is the country of Korea. Looking back, the end of the South Korean president is asylum, assassination, suicide, arrest/imprisonment, scandals of relatives, etc. are following the pathetic end. Where in the world is such a messy developed country? Yes, there is the word racism, but South Korea is still an undeveloped tribal nation. Are Koreans not embarrassed? If you have time to criticize Japan while breaking the rising sun flag, why don't you wipe the hole in your butt? Why has this been repeated endlessly? It is necessary to take a firm look at this reality, which can be said to be the black history of Korean grudges and struggles. What is the South Korean president doing during his term in the first place? While inciting anti-Japanese sentiment, is it the job of the South Korean president to get bribes behind the scenes and get hungry? When I looked it up, the history of Korea after WW2 is the black history that can never be made public. It is a forgery of history. Even if you criticize Japan, no Korean criticizes this black history. Why? It is because the facts are forged, distorted, and not informed to the public. Some Koreans really think that the Korean War is a war that fought against Japan. Now is the time to look closely at the actual history of Korea after WW2. Isn't it in Koreans? Syngmin Rhee. Born March 26, 1875. Korean independence activist and first president of the Republic of Korea, 1948 to 1960. 1. April 3, 1948 Jeju Island 4/3 Incident Rebellion Suppression. following the uprising of the islanders on Jeju Island in South Korea under the control of the U.S. Army military government in Korea. South Korean Constabulary Guard, South Korean Army, South Korean Police, Syngman-rhee supporters on the Korean Peninsula, etc. A series of islander massacres that occurred until September 21, 1954. South Korean officials said the case involved the Workers' Party of South Korea. Great purge by government forces and police. 60,000 people, 1 in 5 of the islanders, were slaughtered. It is also said that 70% of the villages on Jeju Island have been burned down. When the South Korean army attacks the village where the islanders live, they take out and kill young people and kill them. Take out the girls and gangbang for 2 weeks. It is said that he was murdered miserably after repeated abuse. Many people escaped from the battle and went to Japan. It is said that this accounts for most of the ancestors of Koreans living in Japan. When Syngman-rhee entered 1948 and set out to establish a nation in the South alone, unificationist opposition has intensified throughout the South. In particular, Jeju Islanders have intensified their criticism of the administration. Jeju Island has a history of repression and persecution since the time of the Joseon dynasty. It was a region with a strong anti-establishment color. Syngman-rhee chose Jeju Island as a representative of the Chiki area facing him. He decided to mass execute the islanders to show off. At that time, the Northwest Youth League was dispatched to Jeju Island with the military and police. The Yakuza were given the freedom to plunder, rape, and slaughter the islanders. As a result, 60,000 people, 1 in 5 islanders, were killed. Most of the villages on Jeju Island will be burned down. The corpse was thrown into the sea. Many of them arrived in Tsushima and Kitakyushu, where the people of Tsushima and Kitakyushu buried and held memorial services. 2. Yosa Sunshin Incident, Raesui Juntanjikan. The military rebellion that occurred in Yosa County, Jeollanam-do, South Korea, now Yosa City, on October 19, 1948. Civilian murders in Yosa-gun, Jeollanam-do, Yongdeok-gun, Gyeongsangbuk-do, and Gimpo-gun, Gyeonggi-do, currently Gimpo City. Immediately after the founding of the Republic of Korea on August 15, 1948. The Communist Party of South Korea, Workers' Party of South Korea, has infiltrated operatives into the South Korean military forces in various regions. I was looking for opportunities for rebellion and turmoil. To suppress the Jeju 4/3 incident that occurred on Jeju Island on October 19. In the 14th Regiment of the National Defense Guard stationed in Yosa-gun, Jeollanam-do, where a dispatch order was given. A member of the South Labor Party in the unit instigated a rebellion, and the members responded to it, resulting in a unit-wide rebellion. The rebellion extended from Yosa County to the neighboring Suncheon County, now Suncheon City. President Syngman-rhee immediately put in a suppression unit and a week later, on October 27, the rebels were subdued. The remnants then fled into the mountains in the north, where guerrilla resistance continued for a long time. In the case processing, the South Korean government's detection of left-wing forces was extremely harsh. In addition to the rebels, 8,000 unarmed civilians were killed. Many people stowawayed and fled to Japan, which became the background for becoming Koreans living in Japan. 3. Munjeong Massacre Case. On December 24, 1949, in Munjeong County, Gyeongsangbuk-do, Republic of Korea, currently Munjeong City. An incident in which the South Korean army slaughtered 88 unarmed residents for cooperating with the Communist Bandit and committed the Communist Bandit. The 7th Squadron 2nd Platoon 3rd Platoon of the 25th Regiment of the 2nd Division of the Republic of Korea Army. 88 unarmed women, children and old men were shot dead. The genocide has long been concealed as a barbaric act by Communist bandits. Established in 2005 by the Basic Law for the Arrangement of Past History for Truth and Reconciliation. By the Past History Review Committee for Truth and Reconciliation. It was revealed on June 26, 2007 that the crime was committed by the Korean government. 4. Bodo League Massacre Case. June 25, 1950, during the Korean War. Korean Armed Forces, Korean Police, President Syngman Rhee's supporters. A control organization established to re-educate communist convert and their families. A case of massacre of members of the National Guidance Alliance, political prisoners in prison, and civilians. In South Korea, it is also called the Bodo League massacre case. The number of victims has been officially confirmed, 4934. However, there are claims that the number is 200,000 to 1.2 million. Immediately after the April Revolution of 1960, the National Blood Slaughterers Bereaved Family Association, the bereaved family of this case. A report was prepared based on the declaration of the bereaved family, and the report states that the number of people slaughtered was 1.14 million. Until recently, it was taboo to touch the incident in South Korea. It has been said that the massacre was carried out by communists. At the end of the 1990s, the bodies of victims were excavated all over the country. It was confirmed that it was an actual incident. The Korean War broke out on June 25, 1950. The Korean People's Army moved south and approached Seoul. On June 27, President Syngman Rhee ordered the execution of Bodo League members and Workers' Party of South Korea officials. I escaped from Seoul on the same day. South Korean troops and police retreat to Busan. The people registered with the Bodo League were regarded as dangerous molecules, and they were massacred at Daejeon Prison and other places. 5. The bombing of the Hongang Bridge, Kangko-Jindokyo. At 2:30 on June 28, 1950, during the Korean War. South Korean troops blow up the Hongang Bridge, now the Hongang Bridge, in the current Seoul Special City. An incident that killed about 800 civilians. Blasting a bridge in a state of turmoil not only cost civilians a lot, but also it was a big loss for the South Korean army itself that bombed it. At this point, the main forces of the South Korean army, the 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 7th Divisions, and the Capital Defense Command. The battle is still ongoing on the outer defense line of Seoul. In addition, the 1st Division adhered to the position on the south side of Paju. It continued to thwart the North Korean offensive by repeating small counterattacks. However, when the bridge was blown up and the North Korean army rushed into the city, knowing that they had been blocked behind them, each unit began to retreat as if it had hit an avalanche. About that aspect, the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force Executive School, corresponding to the former Army War College, Army War History Research and Dissemination Association by War History Instructors. The main force of the South Korean Army is not only the pressure of the North Korean Army, but also the decisive factor was that he blocked the retreat too early. It is said that it collapsed at an unbelievable rate. 6. Jumjong Cave Civilian Massacre. In October 1950, when the Korean War broke out, Chairman Ma's husband and, 66, has a family of grandfather and father, uncle, eldest brother who was in the 3rd grade of junior high school, second brother of the 5th grade of elementary school, etc. 5 people of 3 generations were taken to the Goyang police station and shot dead without trial. The reason was that my uncle's family went north. Security officials worried about retaliation said, "Keep the seeds of men." He searched every corner of his relative's house, and even caught and killed a young child. Fortunately, Mr. N, the husband of Chairman Ma, who was 5 years old, escaped the disaster by hiding it in a jar by his relative's grandfather. Lee Kyung-suk, General Affairs Officer, 27 years old at the time of the Korean War, leaving a 23-year-old wife and a 4-year-old son, who became pregnant with their second child. After being caught by police at his home in Sinpyeongdong, Goyang. I didn't come back again. The mother-in-law, 84, set up the altar after 10 years of waiting for her husband. The day of the litigation is the night of October 14, 1950, when the police arrived. 45 years have passed since then, on September 30, 1995. In the basement of Kumjong Cave, the seal of that I usually put in my wallet was found. 7. National Defense Corps Incident. In January 1951, during the Korean War, executives from South Korea's National Defense Corps headquarters announced an incident of embezzlement of military supplies and military rice supplied to the National Defense Corps. It is said that more than 90,000 Korean soldiers starved to death due to embezzlement. The National Defense Corps incident, Gakminbo Yugun, morning. Based on the National Defense Corps Establishment Law, promulgated on December 21, 1950. It is a Korean military organization organized by soldiers of the 2nd National Soldier, who are not students. The South Korean Army as of December 1950. From the surprise attack of the North Korean Army to rebuilding the force on the Nakdong River front, while losing 45% of troops. Due to the abolition of the conscription system in March of the same year, it was not possible to convene decent troops only by the usual method. Furthermore, the battlefield, which had been advantageous in the Incheon landing operation, deteriorated due to the participation of the Chinese Volunteer Army, October 19. Following the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, UN forces had begun to retreat from North Korea. Therefore, the South Korean government has to overcome the deteriorating war situation. Approximately 500,000 soldiers were dispersed and accommodated in 51 educational regiments to form the National Defense Corps. I tried to reinforce the strength of the South Korean Army. However, because it is an army that was formed quickly. From the beginning, he had problems such as lack of budget for mobilization, transportation, training, and armament of generals and immaturity of command and control. HR was also confused, and although he had no military experience at the beginning, he tried to appoint Kim Do-han, who had the experience of leading a volunteer army, as a commander, but was refused. After all, at the recommendation of the Minister of National Defense Shin Sung-mo, Kim Jun-ne, Korean Wikipedia, was assigned as the commander, and Woo Masunori, Korean Wikipedia, was assigned as the deputy commander. These two people were only active in the Korean Youth Association, Korean version, of the Syngman Rhee administration. Military relations were completely amateur. Immediately before the inauguration of the Defense Force, the front line was a partially occupied area of the North Korean region, Gwanghae Province, and the coastal area of East Korea Bay. And it had retreated to near the 38th parallel north. The South Korean Army, which was attacked by both North Korean and Chinese troops on January 4, 1951, performed a front-line retreat, so-called 1.4 retreat, operation. The National Defense Corps will mass transfer more than 500,000 soldiers to Daegu and Busan in the rear. However, the executives of the Defense Forces Command illegal disposal and dressing of military supplies and rice for military supplies organized for the National Defense Corps. As a result, there was a shortage of supplies, food, camping equipment, military uniform, for soldiers who retreated on foot in the frigid cold. It was a death march with more than 90,000 starvation and freezing deaths, and countless sick people. 8. Ganghwa Massacre Case. An incident in which the South Korean government slaughtered unarmed islanders on Ganghwa-do from January 6 to 9, 1951. When the South Korean Army regains Ganghwa-do from North Korea by the Incheon landing operation. From January 6 to 9, 1951, the Korean Army, Korean police, and militia, for example, as cooperating with North Korea during the North Korean rule, it slaughtered 1,300 out of 212 islanders. The victims were all unarmed civilians. 9. Sancheon/Xianyang Good People Massacre Special Task Force Case. On February 7, 1951, the 3rd Battalion marched on Rika Toj village, Imanishur, Sancheon-gun, and burned down the houses. After collecting gold items, 123 villagers were pushed into the valley. I lined up in a 4-row line and fired. In addition, 212 residents of Yoshia village, about 2 kilometers away, were also shot. At 13:30, 60 people were slaughtered at Eri, Hamyang-gun, Kyokowamayan. In addition, at Hanakiari, Jieri, and Saishiri, Tadani-ri, and Ikatani-mura on the Inadran side of Hamyang-gun. At around 16:30, we gathered the residents in the gravel area of Dongchanggang, Saishari, with the excuse of holding a lecture. It slaughtered 310 non-family members of the military police. The victims of the Xianyang massacre on February 7 amounted to 705 residents in 12 villages. The document in the photo says, 9 regiments are on February 7, 1951, around 11 a.m. When you arrive at Sanchenggun, Kumsamyang, and Yoshia village. 7 Burakumin fled to the back mountain, so we gathered all the Burakumin and gathered them. The one who ran away ordered everyone to be shot, because he didn't answer when asked. It is the content of the report. At that time, the Special Task Force was a counterintelligence unit that carried out the special mission of President Syngman Rhee. 10. Jiuchang case. From February 9 to February 11, 1951, following Operation Kiono, a hard wall in Xianyang, Yamasei. Under the command of the new division leader Choi Deo at Mt. Chiri in Gyeochanggun, Gyeongsang Namdo, South Korea. The 3rd Battalion of the 9th Regiment of the 11th Division of the Republic of Korea Army, Korean Wikipedia, is under the command of Captain Woo Maju. To annihilate all the communist partisans from Gyeochanggun. It slaughtered 719 inhabitants, 334 over 15, and 385 under 15. The South Korean army slaughtered even the Korean police family, without excluding them. 11. On January 18, 1952, the Syngman Rhee Line was declared. In the 13 years until this line was abolished, Japan-Korea Basic Treaty. The number of Japanese detainees due to the capture of Japanese fishing boats was 3,929, and the number of casualties was 44. Not even given the right to live a satisfying life as a human being. Even the items sent by my family were pulled out by the Korean police and did not arrive. What Syngman Rhee did, no matter how much during the war. It's not something that a decent human can command. Originally, South Korea was a client state of China for 500 years. Before the annexation of Japan and Korea, there was no industry in Korea, the country was poor and the people were hungry. Due to its poor environment, life expectancy is 24 to 5 years old. The main export items are only women who donate to China. In Japan, aristocrats called both groups were doing the limit of domineering. To put it simply, it is an undeveloped barbaric country. However, about 100 years ago, the Qing dynasty of China was destroyed. South Korea has lost its sealer. On the other hand, the neighboring Japan. He won the Sino-Japanese War and became one of the world's top nations. South Korea changed its palm and approached Japan. I tried to become a client state of Japan, not a client state of China. However, it was a proposal that had no merit for Japan. About Japan's annexation of Korea. Some give military reasons to counter the threat of China and Russia, but that is a mistake. However, when Japan rejected South Korea's request to become a client state, South Korea is astonishing. What I did was assassinate Hirobumi Ito, who was the central figure in the refusal of client state. And the month after the murder, Korea will annex Japan on an equal footing to build a new empire. I made a ridiculous statement to the world. As a result, Japan's annexation of Korea was carried out in August 1910. In short, in international diplomacy at that time, not including undeveloped barbaric countries, Japan had no choice but to take care of the Korean peninsula. Japan was in trouble. Japan, which always advocates racial equality. He was forced into the undeveloped barbarian next door. It's easy to talk about slavery like in the West. If you do that, Japan's claim of race equality will become a lie. If so, there is no choice but to annex and educate the barbarians, and remake them into modern nation-states. By doing so, people of color had no choice but to prove that they were human beings. As a result, Japan annexed South Korea. Over the next 35 years, he continued to invest enormous national funds and human resources on the Korean peninsula. Thanks to this, on the Korean peninsula, 8 languages have been unified into one. The number of elementary schools, which was only a few, has increased to 5,200. 2.39 million people who had never been educated before were enrolled for free. Give a name to an unnamed woman, create a family register. Maintain a resident register, build roads, build bridges, lay railroads. The water and sewage system was improved, and the toilet was used to make street stools commonplace. Build a hospital, lay electricity, build a building. Abolishing the old absurd punishment and prisons on the peninsula, etc. He pushed forward with the modernization of the Korean peninsula, with all possible sincerity and power. South Korea's population has doubled. However, when Japan began to rule, there was a resistance movement. A local religious group instigated the people and said, "Don't allow exploitation by Japan." And the people uprised. However, among the people, security under Japanese rule. Above all, when clean life without odor gradually permeates, the anti-Japanese movement naturally subsided. And the Korean peninsula, at least ostensibly, is not a barbarian. The appearance of the human beings of the modern nation began to be arranged. However, before these efforts by Japan were fruitful, Japan lost in the Greater East Asia War. I was leaving the Korean peninsula. The US military has landed on the Korean peninsula as a new ruler. And it came with the US military. It was Syngman Rhee, who worshipped and promoted the Joseon dynasty like an oriental paradise in the United States. Syngman Rhee was when Japan annexed South Korea. He was the person who created the temporary government of the Republic of Korea in Shanghai and was the prime minister. However, far from being a caretaker government, South Korea is not an independent country. Syngman Rhee's request to the United States to make it the League of Nations of the League of Nations is disappointing. This means making South Korea a US colony. Syngman Rhee, who was accused of this by a member of the caretaker government. He secretly escaped from Shanghai and moved to the United States. And Syngman Rhee in the United States. Mr. Lee contributed various myths in English that praised the Joseon era, as if it were a fantastic fairy tale. It happened that this was in line with the United States' intention to launch a war against Japan. Names and faces were selling well in the United States. However, even though he had some politicians in the United States, Syngman Rhee, who returned to the Korean peninsula, has no personal connections or financial resources for political activities on the peninsula. It was the Hunan conglomerate who had been strengthening with the pipe with Japan that noticed this. When Japan, the former ruler, disappeared, he offered to support Syngman Rhee, who has a face in the United States, so as not to lose his power as a chaebol. As a result, Syngman regained the financial strength and domestic connections of the Hunan conglomerate. Finally, in August 1948, the Republic of Korea, now South Korea, was founded. He became the first president. The first job that Syngman Rhee, who became president, did as president was eradication of pro-Japanese factions. He publicly said that the era of Japanese rule was good and the current government is useless. He was arrested and imprisoned as a political prisoner from one end. For those who are imprisoned, revive the cruel torture tools of the Joseon era, which should have been banned since Japan came to rule. When the prison is filled with this, old people in prison are killed one after another without trial. He is a barbarian chief, but thanks to him, only 2 years have passed since Syngman Rhee became the first president. The number of prisoners imprisoned as political prisoners it far exceeds the total number of prisoners in 35 years when Japan ruled Korea. What was the number of casualties caused by the Korean War? The casualties are 200,000 Korean troops. In addition, 140,000 US forces, 220,000 other Allied forces, 290,000 North Korean troops, and 450,000 Chinese Communist troops have been killed or injured. In addition, it is said that 1.33 million civilians and 2.5 million North Koreans were killed in the war that took place in the Korean peninsula for only 3 years. There are more than 5 million casualties in the North and South combined. It is how the Korean War was a miserable and terrible war. By the way, the total weight of the bombs dropped by the US military in this war is about 600,000 tons. This is about 4 times the number of bombs dropped on Japan during the Greater East Asia War. The Korean War was so miserable. The period during which this war took place was from June 1945 to July 1945. And what happened in the middle of this war was? It was the restoration of Japan's sovereignty under the San Francisco Peace Treaty. This treaty was signed in 1952 and came into effect in April 1952. What does this mean? The answer is easy to see when you think about the time. It is the intention to hunt Japan in the increasingly miserable Korean War. In terms of finances, the United States was already tight due to the war with Japan. The Korean War broke out over there. Many Americans were already at war. Why do Americans have to go all the way to Asia and die? Even if we don't do that, we should rearm Japan and let Korea respond. That's why. However, it is Syngman Rhee who is in trouble when that happens. Because for Syngman Rhee, if Japan participates in the Korean War, it is a Japanese army that sounds with strong soldiers. In a blink of an eye with the US military, kicking off the North Korean and Chinese Communist forces. Leading a war to victory is clearer than looking at the fire. In fact, even with the same Korean soldiers, the soldiers who belong to the former Japanese army. For the newly appointed Korean soldiers, the difference in ability was heaven and earth. If Japan participates and drives out North Korea in Japan and the United States, this time Japan will return to the Korean peninsula as a victorious country. If that happens, Syngman Rhee, who has been agitating anti-Japanese and doing a lot of outrageous things, you will definitely be 100% out of power. I want to crush the San Francisco Peace somehow. However, Syngman Rhee is not eligible to participate in the San Francisco Peace Treaty. This is because South Korea has not participated in the Greater East Asia War. During the Greater East Asia War, South Korea was part of Japan, not even a country. So Syngman Rhee does not interfere with the San Francisco Peace itself. We plan to deepen the conflict between Japan and South Korea. Syngman Rhee is in July 1951. We have submitted a request to the US government, which is drafting the San Francisco Peace Treaty. Contents: 1. Transfer of Japanese assets on the Korean peninsula to the Korean government. 2. Takashima and Parangdo are Korean territories. It was such a request. The United States was surprised. At the point where Japan is trying to calm Japan and fight the Korean War, South Korea, which is essential, has deliberately raised a confrontational relationship with Japan. If Japan and South Korea are in conflict, the chances of Japan sending troops for South Korea are 100% eliminated. The United States will be in Syngman Rhee the following month. We accept the transfer of Japanese assets on the Korean peninsula. We do not accept any other requests. I issued a letter with very strict content. It is a Rusk letter. And 1 month later, on September 8, 1945, we signed the San Francisco Peace Treaty with Japan. However, Syngman Rhee, who became more and more vulnerable to the conclusion of the peace treaty, went on a further outrage. On January 8, 1952, suddenly, he announced the declaration of sovereignty over the adjacent ocean, which unilaterally defined the border with Japan. This is what the world calls the Syngman Rhee Line. For the United States, who is wondering what to do, Syngman Rhee will make a further push on the 27th of the same month. The Syngman Rhee Declaration Korean government statement was announced. In this statement, Syngman Rhee said that the Syngman Rhee Line was established in international law. One-sidedly declare only in Japan. Naturally, Japan gets angry if you do such a thing. If it gets angry, Japan will refuse to participate in the war against North Korea. And if Japan does not participate in the war, the wear and tear of the US military in the Korean War will become more and more severe. The United States finally came here and thought about the situation seriously. And Takashima is Japanese territory by the San Francisco Peace Treaty. Syngman-Rhee Line by one-sided declaration of Syngman-Rhee is illegal under international law. To the Korean government. However, Syngman-Rhee crushed this transmission and a Japanese fishing boat operating on the Tsushima Strait is shot and the sailors are captured. For the capture of Japanese fishing boats, I also used the sneaky technique of approaching a Japanese fishing boat with a boat disguised as a Korean fishing boat. After approaching on a fishing boat and smilingly saying "How are you doing?" in Japanese, make the ship stand by in the vicinity. After seeing where the Japanese fishing boat entered the net hoisting work, that is, where it got stuck, killing a Japanese sailor by shooting a machine gun without warning, tracking a Japanese fishing boat trying to escape by cutting off the net in a hurry. It was an extremely sneaky technique of capturing this together with the fishing boat. It is a rule of international law that the military should wear the military uniform of the country concerned. The number of Japanese fishing boats attacked is great. The inside of the ship is a sea of blood, and injured people cannot be treated even if they breathe. Even if you are lucky enough to survive, the containment facility is outrageous, pushing 30 people into a 6-tatami mat room. The food is leftover food, and the water is full for 30 people a day. No one can lie down in a room like a crowded train. I can't even go to the bathroom. I was put in a state where stools were dripping into the room while standing. It's even harder when you're taken out of the room in the name of interrogation. The moment he is released from prison, he is beaten and kicked. When I was finally taken out to the interrogation room, when I was tired and could not resist, there is another assault of hitting and kicking. After all, this Syngman-Rhee Line was abolished until June 1965. It lasted for 13 years. And during this period, a total of 328 Japanese fishing boats were captured by South Korea. There are 39,339 people captured and 44 casualties. The photo shows a Japanese fisherman who was finally released and returned to Japan. Skinny, lean body, swollen face, burnt scalp. Furthermore, the whole body has turned purple due to bruising and laceration. It looks too terrible. That's not the only outrage of Syngman-Rhee. He unilaterally laid the territorial waters line by Syngman-Rhee Line secretly to the US military, who are fighting the Korean War together. I have sent soldiers to Takashima without permission, and have occupied it by military. However, the Japanese government is making good use of these outrages by Syngman-Rhee. That is, South Korea's violence against Japan and with the occupation constitution given to Japan, as Japan has no military power as a shield. He refused to participate in the Korean War. In short, Japan, where the scars of the Greater East Asia War have not healed yet, is more than driven into the war. We prioritized reconstruction in Japan. Also, regarding the fishing sailors who were abducted by South Korea, we asked the US military to. Each time, I request the return to Japan and receive sailors. As a result, Japan's movement at this time refused to participate in the Korean War. While it has had the positive result of promoting domestic reconstruction, preserving the occupation constitution, currently the Constitution of Japan, that should be abolished at the time of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. We have left the downside of that. The United States, which shook Japan's participation in the war due to the outrage of Syngman-Rhee. Ignoring Syngman-Rhee, who wants a continuous battle with North Korea. An armistice agreement is signed with North Korea over his head. This is the event on July 27, 1945. Since then, the Korean peninsula has been divided into north and south at the 38th parallel north. However, Syngman-Rhee, who was dissatisfied with this truce, POWs of the North Korean army housed in South Korea. We are carrying out a violent act of releasing and expelling all of them in Japan without any connection. The exiled POWs have caused incidents in various parts of South Korea, causing disasters for many Koreans. The US government has been protesting Syngman-Rhee's selfish actions, but it was a later festival. In this way, it was Syngman-Rhee who carried out tyranny as a tyrant rather than the president. It wasn't until 1960 that his politics finally collapsed. A demonstration by the people to overthrow Syngman Rhee took place in Korea. The demonstration, which spread throughout Korea, killed as many as 186 people. Finally, U.S. Ambassador to Korea, McCann G, visited Syngman Rhee. If the president does not resign, the United States will even declare that it will stop financial assistance to South Korea. Syngman Rhee, who was abandoned by the United States, said, "The position of executive branch is gone, and only the position of head of state remains." But this also made the Korean people angry. The statue of Syngman Rhee in Pagoda Park was pulled down by the people. The National Assembly of South Korea has unanimously demanded the immediate resignation of President Syngman Rhee. This finally puts an end to the Syngman Rhee regime. And while Syngman Rhee committed suicide to his adopted son, he fled to the United States alone and survived until he was over 90 years old. Although Syngman Rhee himself was dismissed, the Syngman Rhee line was maintained thereafter. This was abolished when a military coup d'état occurred in 1965, Showa 31. It was after the new administration of President Park Chung-hee was born in South Korea. President Park Chung-hee, who graduated from the Japanese Army Academy, and was a Japanophile. In June 1965, the Japan-Korea Basic Treaty was signed with Japan. The Syngman Rhee line has been abolished. Then, with Japan's economic assistance, we promoted industry in South Korea. As a result, South Korea will undergo great economic development, called Miracle on the Han River. However, although the Syngman Rhee line was abolished in this Japan-Korea Basic Treaty, regarding Takashima, the territory of Japan without conflict in both Japan and South Korea at that time. Based on this recognition, no special agreement was made. For this reason, Takashima is still the source of fire for Japan and South Korea. By the way, when we Japanese hear the name of the president, I have the image of a representative of the rule of law like the US president. But the president in South Korea, like the undeveloped barbarian chief. It's just a kind of absolute power. And the person in absolute power flutters the citizens and performs anti-Japanese work. You devour your interests for your own benefit. The recent Moon Jae-in administration is a typical example. And the origin of South Korea's anti-Japanese day is Syngman Rhee, the first president of South Korea. In short, Syngman Rhee had only his own desire for power. And Korea is still stuck in the delusion of Syngman Rhee. However, sticking to my desire for power and ideology. As a result, it caused a great war called the Korean War. The delusion of Syngman Rhee, who killed the people in millions and left South Korea poor for 20 years after the war. After all, did it bring happiness to Koreans? And because of clinging to power. During the Korean War, he drew the Syngman Rhee line and occupied Takashima. What is it doing for the Korean people? It's just sowing the seeds of conflict. The Japanese firmly look at the truth of history. We must regain the true history from the history that was twisted after the war. And the Korean people who have the same heart are gone all day long. I just hope that you will be awakened to the truth of history. Koreans lie. Chinese people were still better, is the word of an old lady who lived on the pre-war peninsula. The Japanese and people all over the world should never forget this word. Don't be fooled by Korean lies. That's all.